Hello, I'm Mika Smith, and I am a senior story producer here at Ancestry, and I'm so excited to spend some time with you today talking about researching enslaved ancestors on Ancestry. I'm going to give folks some time to get settled so that we can get started. So I'm here in the office. If you may have joined me the last time we did a session on researching your African American ancestors, I was remote doing it, but I am here in our office in um, Lehigh, Utah. So I'm super excited. Let me know if you're here watching live, where you're checking in from. Some of you are already doing that. Great. I see people from Detroit and from Georgia and from North Carolina. I love to see that chat moving, especially if you're here live. If you're watching the recording, I'm super excited for you to also let us know where you're checking in from, where you're researching. For some of you, it may be super duper cold where you are. And where if I was normally at home, it would be super duper cold for me as well. If you're here watching live, don't forget you can place questions in the Q&A section so that they can be answered. I'm also here with some wonderful colleagues who are in member services and with pro-genealogists who are also here to answer your questions to make sure that you get the most out of this experience and this session. All right, one of the things I also want to remind everybody about, especially if you are new to Ancestry and you're not quite sure exactly the offerings and things that we have for African American people or those folks who are doing African American research, be sure to tap into ancestry.com/Black History. That page will lead you to a guide, which will go over some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. It will also show you some of the collections that we have available, things that are available for free, things that are available with a subscription on the site. Regardless, that can be your one-stop shop for researching African American history with Ancestry. All right, so let's go ahead and get started because we got a lot to cover today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so we are here for researching the enslaved on Ancestry. And in this particular session, we're just going to talk about the unique challenges that you may encounter when you're researching your family into the 19th century or just prior to the Civil War. You're going to learn clues to look for in records such as the 1870 census and other things, and tips to continue research even further back through time to unearth crucial details about your formerly enslaved ancestors. Now, if this is the first session that you are joining me for with regard to researching your enslaved ancestors, I do want to point something out. This is definitely an intermediate session. So if you missed the previous session that I did that was on researching your African American ancestors on Ancestry, that recording is available on our YouTube channel. So if you're here and you feel a little overwhelmed or you feel like it's a lot of information that again, you're just kind of out of sorts trying to figure it all out, you may need to start with the beginning session just to make sure that you get all the fundamentals down, and then you can move on to this one, which is a little bit more intermediate and potentially too advanced in terms of research. All right. The other thing I also want to point on as well is we also have other sessions that are specific to researching and family tree building, learning how to use the family tree on Ancestry, as well as DNA 101. We are going to touch on some of those things a little bit today, but again, our primary focus is going to be on researching the enslaved on Ancestry. All right, so as usual with any session I am doing, I will always start it off with questions that we need to answer and just scene setting with regard to the topic at hand. And when we're talking about researching our formerly enslaved ancestors, one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is, and just asking ourselves, is have you traced your family tree from present back to 1865? And the reason why this is important, and some of you may be thinking, well, why not 1870? Is because the 1870 census is the first census in theory that all African Americans, regardless of if they were free or formerly enslaved, are included by name on the census. But there was a 5-year time period between when slavery ended as a result of the 13th Amendment and the 1870 census. So, in essence, yes, we want to get back to 1870, but really we want to try to get back as close to 1865 as we possibly can. So, the first thing to ask is how close have you been able to get to 1865? For some people, they can only trace their ancestors back to the 1880 census, and that's fine. That's totally okay. But what efforts have you done to try to trace back from now to 1865? Not skipping over generations, not, because you already know that you have a great great grandparent and you want to look for information on them. You have to do the foundational research, the sound genealogy research of starting from you, going back through the generations, validating the oral history, validating through the paper trail, validating through DNA that that information is correct. And you're making your best effort to get back to 1865. Some of us, it's easier than others, but that doesn't mean that you give up in the process of trying to get to the information. Now, the second question we have to ask is, have you confirmed your ancestors were enslaved or free people of color? Who are free people of color? Free people of color are those individuals in the United States, or maybe even if you're talking in the Caribbean, who were free prior to the abolition of slavery. And so if you're researching in the Caribbean, you're talking, what, 1830s or so? People who were free before that time period. If you're talking in the United States, you're talking earlier than 1865, those individuals who were not enslaved. And also, despite common belief, do not think that there weren't free people of color who were living in states that had high populations of enslaved people. You will find free people of color living all across the United States during the slavery era. In fact, 10% of the population of African Americans in the United States before the Civil War were free. So if you have 4 million enslaved people in 1860, you have 400,000 free people of color. Some folks make the mistake of not searching for their ancestors on censuses prior to 1860 or 1870 rather, because they assume that their family was enslaved when in fact their ancestors may have been free. And if they were free, they should have been reflected on the 1860 federal census, and as well as other censuses prior to that. Censuses in the United States started in 1790. So if your ancestors were never enslaved, they would be on the census in theory, starting from 1790 all the way going through until slavery is ending. Okay. So again, have you traced your family history prior to or get as close to 1865 as possible? Have you confirmed your ancestors were enslaved or whether or not they were free people of color? How would they have been free? It's a great question asked in the chat. There's a number of means. When you manumitted an enslaved person, you all may have heard that term being used. That was something that was done by private act, meaning that if you were a slaveholder, you could, in your will, stipulate that, in the division of your property, that your enslaved people would be free. So that would be a manumission. And enslavers also have the ability to go to the courthouse or get with a justice of the peace or a notary and issue a statement freeing their formerly enslaved or their enslaved people. So that would be a manumission. And emancipation is an act that happens by law. That's why you have the Emancipation Proclamation. Also, depending on the state that a person lived in, northern states, they had what was called gradual emancipation. And so with that, it was as of a certain year and certain stipulations, it would be a child attaining a certain age or of a certain year, they would begin the process of freeing those who were enslaved. Many people think, oh, there was no slavery in the North. That is not true. There was slavery in places like Pennsylvania, slavery in places like New York and in New Jersey. And in those northern states, they had what was called gradual emancipation. So again, sort of a long-winded way of saying this, but that's how people could become free. The other thing I also want to point out is that enslaved children took on the disposition of their mother while she was pregnant with them. So if I was pregnant with a child and I was free, my child would be born free. But if I was enslaved when my child was born, my child would be enslaved. All right. So one more question. What oral history do you have about your ancestors? And sometimes oral history can be a little bit controversial in a sense because it can lead us down the wrong path. going completely in the wrong direction. And I have had that in my experience. But also, oral history can also direct us to the right places that we should be. Some of us have had great oral history that has come down around our family's origins while they were enslaved. And some of us have not. Maybe some of the clues may be in oral history, but not on the nose, meaning it may be that you have oral history about your family owning particular land and that the land is connected to the slaveholder. You may not have the name of the slaveholder, but you will know, you could identify where the land is, and then that will then lead you to the who the slaveholder was. It may be that the history is that your family continued to work for the slaveholding family after slavery ended. So the relationship moved from being enslaver and enslaved to employer and employee. If that is the situation, then you could potentially go and find records, maybe with the Freedmen's Bureau, like labor contracts, where you see these early relationships soon after emancipation reflected on paper. So there are a number of ways, but don't disregard that oral history. You just want to go out and try and validate it as much as you possibly can. And you guys are doing excellent with these questions and comments here live. Of course, again, if you're watching the recording, make sure that you do the same thing as well. Engage, because the more we all talk and dialogue and exchange information, the easier it's going to be for all of us to be able to get over these brick walls, especially when it's regarding enslavement. I've been in a lot of different live sessions, and I've seen people make connections with other people in the same virtual space who are researching the same enslaving families or the same enslaved, and they didn't know that they were in the space. So share the information that you have. There may be somebody who's already here who knows more than you do and can provide you some resources. So don't disregard that comment section, and don't disregard the live chat as well. All right, so here's the next question, okay? And thank you all for the comments. You guys are doing a great job. Where does enslavement start in your family tree? This is something that we all need to be cognizant of. Why is it important? Because when you are thinking about the proverbial timeline of your respective family history, you just need to be clear where the enslaved people fall, okay? And here's just an example of how this falls out within my family history. We all have 4 grandparents, okay? So my grandparents were born really between 1909 and 1919, okay? So they're born in the early 20th century. But then when we get to my great grandparents, those individuals are born during Reconstruction. They are born soon after slavery is abolished. So just think about time period. Hopefully you all don't think I'm that old, but I bring this up on purpose. You've got to know what your timeline is, because your timeline is going to tell you when you need to shift and pivot your research from looking for people who are reflected as people on records to people who are being reflected as property. Okay? So if you've got 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, you also want to think about the next generation. For me, enslavement starts at my great great grandparents. This means that my grandparents' grandparents were enslaved. My grandparents' grandparents were enslaved. That means that from me to my parents, to my grandparents, to my great grandparents, to my great great grandparents, I am going 5 generations of tracing. And when I hit that 5th generation, those are the enslaved people. And that's where you have to pivot. If you are here live, chime in the chat. When does enslavement start in your family? Some of you are saying, same with me, great great grandparents, 3 times great grandparents. And even if you're not entirely sure yet if your folks were free people of color or not, or if they were enslaved, where do you guess enslavement starts in your tree? For me, it's just 5 generations. It's great great grandparents. Then when you keep going, you've got 32 great 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 grandparents, 64 great 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 grandparents. And then when you get to the 5 times great grandparents level, that's where my transatlantic slave trade ancestors are. meaning the people that survived the transatlantic slave trade, there are up to 128 of those individuals. And not all of those people came from Africa on my tree. Some of those folks came from Europe. And I'm laying this out in this way because I want all of us to be very clear about the shifts and changes that occur. There are folks say, I can't imagine that far back. It's okay. Do the math of generations. If you don't have the names yet, it's perfectly fine. You can approximate that these individuals were your transatlantic slave trade ancestors if you do the standard math around 20 years per generation, maybe even a little bit more, depending on when people have children in your family. But just keep this in mind that by the time we get back to 5 times great grandparents, for a lot of us that have African ancestry, we're going into the transatlantic slave trade. And that's the thing. Someone's asking a great question. How do we know if they came from Africa? Well, one of the tools that you can use is DNA that can give you different percentages. I'm going to touch on that briefly because it's one of the cheat codes that we could potentially use to figure out the exact location of where our ancestors were formerly enslaved. So let's move into the steps, okay? Number 1, try to trace to 1870 or earlier. And what you're trying to do is you're trying your best to find your ancestors in these specific records, okay? And I'm calling out specific ones on purpose. The 1870 census is key because that is establishing for us where our ancestors were within 5 years of the Civil War ending and slavery being abolished. Now, does that mean that the place that they were at in 1870 was where they were enslaved? Yes, but also it's possible that it was not. When you start going through records, through agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau, you will see things where people are being given transportation from one location in the South to another, and it happened after the war. It didn't happen as a result of enslavement. It wasn't their slaveholder taking them from Georgia to Louisiana or from Arkansas or Alabama to Texas. It's that they left after, they came after. So again, 1870 is key, but it's not a 100% foolproof way of being able to validate whether or not your ancestor was enslaved in that specific community. It does give us really good clues though, and it is invaluable. So from there, you also have the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank. Many people think they are the same entity. No, they were 2 different entities. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was established by Congress in March of 1865. So we are almost to the day, 160 years after the institution was created. And the Bureau did things like they were over schools, hospitals, labor contracts, over the US colored troops. They had a very broad coverage of the areas that they were over. In addition, if you look at the name, the Bureau of Refugees, the refugees were poor white folks. The freedmen were the formerly enslaved and free people of color. Okay? Freedmen's Bank operated, it opened up a bank where the formerly enslaved could have a place to deposit their money. And some of the records that the Freedmen's Bank created were these deposit slips or account opening slips where people were recording the names of their children, their spouses, their siblings, their parents, their occupations, all of that kind of stuff. And yes, folks are asking, yes, there will be a recording of this after. There's also Civil War related stuff. You have nearly 200,000 Black men who enlist to fight as a part of the Union during the Civil War. And not only that, but you also have women that were nurses, cooks, and laundresses for the Union troops. There are records associated with this. We're going to see all of these things today because I want you all to realize, yes, there is no one size fits all for everyone. Everyone is going to have to take a different slice of this in order for them to try to find their ancestors. For some, the 1870 census is the key. For others, the Freedmen's Bureau might be it. For others, it may be the bank. For others, it may be Civil War. I want to give you all of these things so that you can choose the route that works best for you, okay? How do we access Freedmen's Bureau? It is free. It is available on Ancestry. In fact, I believe it's ancestry.com/freedmen's, or you can go to the URL I gave you earlier, ancestry.com/Black History, and you will have a link to the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay. Also, marriages. Think about the fact that our ancestors, in many states, it was illegal for them to marry as enslaved people, right? They didn't have the possibility of marrying because they weren't considered a person. So one of the first things that they did after the war ended and after slavery ended was they went and got married. And in some states, it was illegal for a man and a woman to live together or cohabitate unless they were married. So they had to go and get a marriage license. And for many of our ancestors, that was the first record that you see them documented on. And it can provide you clues as to what their lives were like prior to slavery ending. And these are just the basic records, you all, but there are so much more. That's the thing. All weren't documented. The marriages, well, here's the thing. Someone mentioned that in the chat. In some states, if you were informally enslaved and you were living together as husband and wife, and they would say, if you were already doing that, then we're going to solemnize your marriage. We're going to consider that to be legal. In other states, they made it a requirement to go and get a marriage certificate. So you have to be clear on what the situation was in the respective state that your ancestor was living in. And here's the other thing I also want to point out to you all. If you found an ancestor on the 1870 census, you've traced before 1870. This is one of the most pervasive things I hear people say, well, I can't get before 1870, but I trace my ancestors to the 1870 census. And I go, if somebody was on the 1870 census, you trace before 1870. You can't be on 1870 unless you were alive in 1870. Does that make sense? So if someone's on there, they're 5 years old, that means they were born in 1865. You've traced before 1870. If they're on there and they are 30 years old, that means they were born in 1840. You've traced before 1870. There's someone in the chat that said, I never thought about it like that. It's true. So don't hold yourself, literally don't stand at the wall and there's a handle and a door you can open and you can walk right through it. Don't do that to yourself. If this session is that for you, let me give you that, okay? All right, so we talked about getting to 1870, seminal record set, okay? You wanna review what you have. One, again, this is something I constantly say, the most underutilized records that we have, that most underutilized records are the ones we already have. The most underutilized records are the ones that we already have in our possession. And what can you learn by reviewing the stuff you already have? Because there are clues abounding. And what you read and what you see today is not what you're going to read and see 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now, based on you continuing the genealogical process and gathering information. Because that name as an informant on a death certificate is just a name today. A month from now, a year from now, a week from now, that could be the name of the child of a former slaveholder. But unless you continue the process of gathering and reviewing, you are going to miss things. And I'm not saying this being preachy to you all. I'm preaching to myself. Okay? So review what you have already. What can you learn from that? When you have a good timeline, using the person page on Ancestry, where you're literally calling out and looking at all the different hallmarks and facts that you have for your ancestor, what can you learn when you look through that? What can you learn when you go back through the census and other records that you already have? Where were your ancestors living? This is very key, because so many of us, our ancestors were found in 1870 and 1880 in the very places that they were enslaved. For some of us, they never left the land. And for some of us, our families are still in the same land. And there are folks asking about the Caribbean. This applies across the board, you all. This is not just US specific. It's not, right? And so with that said, where were they living? If we're talking the Caribbean, what parish were they in? Was that parish originally a part of another parish that has a different name? And you're going to look for the just complete, like, wrong place because it didn't exist when slavery was going on in a particular location. It's the same thing stateside. Where were they living? Who was living around them? What are you seeing in terms of patterns? Are all the people on the same page, even though your family's in Texas, but everybody's born in Louisiana on the page? How did they get to Texas? Okay. Who were they involved with? Who were they doing business with? Who are they reflected in documents with? Who are the witnesses for their marriages, for their land transactions, on their wills, their estates, all of that? Who were they involved with? Because those early records are basically giving us the roadmap as to who to look for. And here's the other thing, especially if you're finding a scenario where your ancestors have the same names as white families in their area, meaning you have an ancestor named James King, James Winston King, and there's a white man in the exact same area or a white boy in the same area, 1870 census with the same name, James Winston King. Could it be a name that was given by inspiration, or could there be a deeper tie there? These are the questions that you need to ask. What can your DNA tell you? Because DNA also can help us. There's many of us who are products of the Great Migration, and we just know our family is from Alabama. We don't know the town, we may not know the county, but things in our DNA can also help us drill down to exact locations as to where our families are from. And I'm going to take a little bit of a deviation right now, and I'm going to show you one of the ways that you can do this. So let's look at newspapers.com, or not newspapers, this is DNA, the Ancestry DNA, because we're going to get to newspapers in a second. But if you have done an Ancestry DNA test, and we're looking at mine, okay, one of the things you have available to you is called DNA journeys. And with these particular journeys, they are actually tracing your history to within the last 150 to 200 years. So if you are not entirely clear as to where your ancestors are from, or your ancestors may have been enslaved, you might be missing clues that are hiding in the origins area of your DNA and in the journeys section. You see all of these little pinpoints on the map, you all? These are all the areas in my existing tree that my ancestors have been traced back to. And notice this big orange I call a pork chop. This is a big, gigantic section called Early Southern US African Americans. It covers several states. But note that all of my ancestors that I've traced on my tree all their pins are within that. And then if you drill down further to this respective DNA journey, notice that I have 11 ancestors that are coming from this respective journey. And here's the thing, if you zoom in, you all, it'll give you a geographical area. So if you're puzzled as to what potentially this could be doing to help your research, I just really want to hone in. And yeah, I know it's almost lunchtime too. I like pork chops. But you might be missing this, you all. Some of this information is already there. This is based on your matches and your trees matches. And look at this small one, you all. Look at this. Look at how small that area is. It's tiny. You might be missing this with regard to your DNA because you might just be stuck on percentages, or you might be on your matches and you're not paying attention to the additional technology that your DNA journeys is giving you. And it may steer you in the correct direction. Some of these go down to counties. Okay? So don't disregard that, all right? Please don't disregard that. Okay, so we're in our review stage, okay? Next, what we want to do is we want to search and build. Whoops, let me go back. We want to search and build, all right? You want to review, okay? You want to get context, you want to search and build. Today, what we're going to talk about are important collections. For me, I call these the trifecta: Freedmen's Bureau, Freedmen's Bank, Civil War related wills and probates. Okay? Freedmen's Bureau, Freedmen's Bank, Civil War related wills and probates. Okay? And there's also miscellaneous records. Now when we're going into the search techniques, okay, the search part, because some of you have been like, come on, get through the slides so we get to the search. No, we got to get the foundation first. Y'all know how I teach. This is how I do it, okay? The thing I also want to point out to you all is that when you're researching formerly enslaved people, you are likely going to have to build trees for the slave holding family. And for some people, this may be extremely uncomfortable. And I get it, I understand it. But what you need to know, what you need to understand is that just how you need to know the mechanics of what is going on with your family, you also have to do the same thing with the slaveholding family. The reason why is because the slaveholding family, as they have children, as they move, our ancestors are doing the same thing. Okay? So you have to research the slave holding family. You do. And again, there may be a lot of emotions tied to this. But because there was money, because there were resources, because there was equity in the personhood of our ancestors, we have to trace the slaveholding family. In some instances, especially when you get into the slavery era, you have to know the slaveholding family history better than your own. I hope you all are listening, okay? Because you've got to map, you've got to have those relationships mapped out, and you have to have your family mapped out. And through knowing the slaveholder, when you get into these wills and these probates, you will then be able to know he's talking about his daughter, he's talking about his wife, he's talking about his niece, he's talking about his brother. You have to know those things. Otherwise, you will get lost in the sauce and you will put it down and you won't pick it back up. And I don't want you all to do that. Okay? And some of you are saying it sucks. I get it. I know that. But I'm telling you right now, it will make you the best researcher possible. Okay? Some of you may choose to have the slaveholding family and your family within the same tree. That is perfectly fine. Some people, you will choose to have separate trees. You set the rules. You set it. But the more empowered you are around the information and the history, the easier it is going to be for you on this journey. Okay? So, yes, great comments. You all are doing excellent in the live session. Definitely, I hope you're also commenting as well. You're watching the recording. Sometimes the slaveholding family is your family. And usually the place that you typically see this is in your DNA matches. Okay? You will see it reflected there. You may have the slaveholding family reflected in your through lines with a dotted line around the potential ancestor. And I want to hold space for everyone because I'm stopping here kind of a little bit because I want you all to understand. I understand what this is like. I'm not on a high, no, been there in it with you. Okay? Eye-opening, I stopped researching when I saw the possible slaveholder. Yes, because you're taking a step back, and that's fine. That is okay. You do it in the way that you need to do it. Okay? Yeah, there's folks here that are descended from slaveholding families. I'm descended from slaveholding families. Many of us are. But here's what I want to empower you with today. What I want to empower you with today is the knowledge that you are the chosen one to do this. And you are the one who is brave enough and has the resources enough and the know-how and the access to do it so that your family can get the information that they need. You can. I believe in all of you that you can do it. It is beyond possible. Okay. All right. So we're going to go back to slides because we got some searching to do, don't we? Yes, we got some searching to do. All right. I want to come back to oral history really quick because we're gonna finish what we started with the initial researching African American ancestors on Ancestry. We started with my grandmother, who was born about 1916, lived to be almost 100 years of age. She died just short of 100 years of age. And we traced her from the 1950, the 1940 census, 1930, 1920, which was the first one she showed up on. We found my great grandparents that confirmed the information that I had. Then we moved from there to my great grandfather and great grandmother on 1910, 1900 together. Then we found my great grandfather on the 1880 census. And then he was in the household with his parents. I then found his father on 1870. That is where we are at this juncture. That's why you have to do your pre-work to get as close to 1870 as possible. Since we're talking in the context of researching the enslaved, okay? What I want to point out is oral history that I have. You're looking at the bottom of a family tree that was produced by my cousin, Dr. John Wesley Atlas, in 1985. He was the initial person that started our family history before I was even thinking about it. And my first cousin, once removed, talked to my grandmother, talked to my grandmother's siblings, talked to the elders in the family, and was able to get oral history that I had no way of being able to get because I wasn't old enough. And one of the things that he did in getting this oral history is he wrote up a synopsis at the bottom of this family tree. And if you ever hear me talk about how I came to genealogy and family history, this tree that you're looking at is a seminal reason why. When I was a 6-year-old child, 5 and 6-year-old child, I would roll this out on the table and I would read it. And I'd ask my mom questions. And one of the reasons why I'm showing this to you all is because it has important information. If you're looking at the top of the image, you're seeing the name of my great great grandfather, King Jr., in relation to his parents, King the First and Rachel Atlas. The reason why this is important is because there is no United States census that lists King Jr., who I've traced through the paper trail, as my great great grandfather. There is no United States census that says that his parents are King and Rachel. So the only lead I have around who King's parents are, him being born between 1840 and 1850, is this extract from a family tree. It's from the oral history. That's it. If I strictly relied on the paper trail, I would not know who my third great grandparents were. I had to use the oral history. Okay, so that's where we're starting this journey. Again, we're starting from the vantage point of continuing the work on the tree that we already started. Okay, now this is the tree where as we have it. Okay, based on that oral history, we're going to take this particular node out and we're going to add King Atlas Sr. as the parent of King Atlas Jr. And the oral history stated he was born about 1810, and it mentioned that he was born in Georgia. Now, where's my cousin getting this information from? I would imagine that he probably got it from looking at microfilm of the US Census prior to our digital age of genealogy, right? Going through the microfilm, okay? He also mentioned Rachel. We don't know her maiden name, but based on that oral history, it says she was born between 1805 and 1820. And we're going to put between, and you can use a range. I hope you all are recognizing that I'm using ranges because you can use a range. It does not have to be an exact date. And you see, it's going to give you an area. Are you sure? Yep, I'm sure. I want to use a range. And she is born in Virginia. Okay. And we're going to save. Now we have information that can get us back a prior generation. We know King's born between 1840 and 1847 based off of census records. We have him on 1870, but we have not searched for his parents. One way that we can do it, right, you use maiden names only, but what if you don't have a maiden name? Sometimes you don't have a maiden name. So you enter in what you have until you can change it. You can always go back and change it. So you can search here from this profile, from the tree page. Literally just search. Press search here. It's pretty much what you can do. You can also do a search from the person page. Now, again, I don't have any records for these two people, okay? I have none. So that means I need to trace them back further. So here we have King Atlas in East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, living at Longwood, and he's married to a Rachel Atlas. And the years about match. Now, again, I told you there is no census that has these people as King Jr.'s parents. There's none. So I've still got to do my due diligence. I've got to prove it out. Okay, got to prove out the oral history. So we have King and Rachel, and then they have two younger children in the household who are listed as sons, but I'm pretty sure these are grandchildren because Rachel, I'm pretty sure she was done with having the babies at that point. Okay, we're just going to make an assumption. And there's someone in the chat who was saying sometimes when I search from the person page, it says it's too specific. You can go in and edit what the search is. Okay, it doesn't. You can take out information as well if it's too specific and make it more granular. The reason why I'm changing Georgia is because this census is telling me Alabama. It's giving me a different state. So until I can rectify that conflict, I'm going to put it in the United States because it's the United States. Okay, Georgia or Alabama is United States. This is coming into conflict with what the record oral history I had said. So I'm going to check this out and I'm just going to make it USA because it may be Virginia or it may be Alabama. Okay, these two kids, listen, I'm calling it a truce. Rachel wasn't having them kids at that age. Okay, she wasn't. So I'm not going to add them as children because I actually think that they're grandchildren. Now, from here, now we've got a record saved, okay? We want to go to the 1870 record. For 1870, the birth date matches, the location matches. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a minute. 1880 said that they were living in East Carroll Parish, but now it says Carroll Parish. Well, you have to know your geography, okay? Geography meaning East Carroll Parish was a derivative of Carroll Parish. Carroll Parish was broken into two, East and West Carroll. This is why you need to know your geography. So let's go to 1870 for King and Rachel. Is there any way of finding out the real family name and not the slave master's name? Absolutely. My family did not choose the name of the slaveholder. Thank you, Georgette. Yes, always have a map open. Always, if you're not clear. Now, look at this census. Remember, I told you my cousin in the oral history said that King was born in Georgia and Rachel was born in Virginia. This is likely where he got that information. Pay close attention to what's on this census. Notice you've got King and Rachel. Notice she's listed as being 20 years older than him, which is could put you know that's where the range of 1805 to 1820 starts to show up because 1880 had her birth at 1820, 1870 has it as 1805 or around, right? King's age matches, but note that King has a personal estate of $600. Why is it important that 5 years after slavery, a Black man who was likely formerly enslaved has a personal estate of $600, meaning not the soil. The soil is real estate value. But livestock, farming implements, all of that. Where would surnames come from? They didn't come from slaveholders. My family chose this name. There are no Atlas slaveholders. I have other branches of my family where they clearly chose the surname of the slaveholder. With this one, they did not. The other thing I will also point out to you all is that do not make an assumption that, for instance, if we go up this page and we see D. Pickett, that D. Pickett's last slaveholder had the last name Pickett. It could have been two slaveholders before that. It could have been the mother slaveholder and not the father slaveholder. Don't always stick soundly or strictly to the last name, the last name, the last name, because it could be a number of different things. Now, King, again, birthplace of Georgia. We got Virginia for his wife, Rachel. Okay. So great questions. Did King own land and property? Can you likely trace that back to the end of the war, where it came from? Here's the thing. He had a skilled trade. This is oral history. He was a carpenter, which is why you would have a lot of personal estate. And yes, some of you are commenting live that this is great cursive, and it is great cursive. Because I've seen censuses that are a hot mess in terms of the writing. So we've got Georgia, we've got Alabama, right? But again, still two places in the United States. So we're going to put USA for now, and we're going to save to the tree. Now, here is probably the most important thing you all are going to hear from me today. Okay. Many of you want to find your ancestors as formerly enslaved people, and you want to get them or document them during enslavement through your direct ancestor, meaning I want to find King Atlas Jr. and King Atlas Sr. As enslaved people, and I want to do it through searching through them. And what has been my experience is that when you stay strictly to searching through your direct ancestors, you may miss the fact that you can get the information on who the slaveholder was and what their life was like before 1865 by merely tracing and searching their siblings. I hope you all heard me. Sometimes getting the answer to who enslaved your ancestors or context on a fact or thing you want to validate can only happen when you research the siblings of your direct ancestors. So I know you want this experience like we had in the movie where we traced back to Africa and it was through the. Sometimes it doesn't happen like that, y'all. Sometimes you have to go through your ancestors' siblings. And I'm going to show you why this makes a difference. When I try to search for King, when I try to do the typical stuff, you find an Atlas slaveholders in East Carroll Parish, does not exist. Go to the nearest white person on the census and see if they were your slaveholders. No. They want their slaveholders. So I looked for white folks with the last name Atlas in the same parish. There aren't any. When I looked at the nearest white person on the 1870 census to my ancestors, they weren't my ancestors' slaveholder. Because in essence, what I'm looking for prior to 1865 is I likely want to have a family group, which is King and Rachel and King, and whatever the other siblings are. If I go back to my slides and with the oral history, that tree told me who the siblings of King Jr. were. They were William, they were Andrew, they were John. He had all brothers. So ideally, if I'm finding King Sr. and Rachel and all of their sons on a record, I need to see them as a family group so that I know that it's them and the location should match. But when I looked for a slaveholder with the last name Atlas in the same area, did not exist. When I looked at the nearest white person, did not exist. When I tried the Freedmen's Bureau looking for King and Rachel, did not find them in that. But what I did find were newspaper articles. Newspapers.com is a sister site of Ancestry. And if you are not using this, or if you do not have the basic subscription or even newspapers publisher extra, let me encourage you to get this today for this very reason. Why? When you are talking about the institution of enslavement and how our ancestors walked into life as free people and actualized themselves as US citizens, you will find things in the newspaper recorded way after slavery was over that talk about their lives during enslavement. And again, this is daily, weekly lives of our ancestors. I went over because I knew we had the newspaper from East Carroll Parish. And I literally put in King Atlas, put in John Atlas, William Atlas, right? And one of the things that I found was a newspaper article from 1889. And when you come over to this newspaper article, I want you all to read with me what it says. Oh, let me refresh. I want you to read what it says. This is in the context of a newspaper article about what Black folks are doing in the parish for themselves. And it was not published until 1889. It says, the Atlas family of Negroes are well known in this parish as an industrious people. They used to belong to Colonel Short's family. John Atlas, one of its members, owns 80 acres in the same tract. This newspaper article just told me that my great-great-grandfather's brother purchased the land we were enslaved on. Now, here's what I also want to add to this conversation, you all. My grandmother's sister told me this. Auntie told me. I said, well, where were we enslaved? I'm asking her, because her grandparents were enslaved people. Where were you enslaved? Well, we own the land. That's what she said. And I thought so then I went and researched Grandpa Babe. I researched her dad, and I'm looking at that land, and I'm not finding that we're connected to this slaveholder. The whole time I didn't know it was Uncle John. So he came back and bought 80 acres of land. His father had $600 worth of personal estate. When you brought John and Andrew and William and King Sr. all together, they had over $1,000+. It was $4,000 worth of personal estate in 1870. You don't get that value unless you have skilled trades or something has had to happen. So what do you do once you have this article? We don't have a first name for Colonel Short. We don't. So now we have to find him. There was only one person in the entire parish that had the last name Short, and it was a man named Hugh Short, who was a lawyer. And when we move over to wills and probates for East Carroll Parish, Louisiana, we find the succession, which is just another word for probate, for Hugh Short. Look at when it's recorded, you all. February 2nd of 1863. What's going on at this time? We are in the full throes of the Civil War. You ideally want the slaveholder to have passed away by the time before 1865, because you want them to have a will or a succession or a probate that lays out their property, whether it's through an inventory, whether it is through a will. You want to see that because it's going to have enslaved people. And so here they're starting the succession process, and they admit the information. And then we get to the will of Hugh Short. And it says, being attacked with a hemorrhage this morning, which may be from the lungs, I think it best to make my will at the same time, to say, there being no white person on the place, I do not wish any suspicion to rest on any of my Negroes, as some persons might think I died by the hands of violence. Not so. This is written September 29th of 1861. He had a medical situation And because we are in the throes of the war, he did not want anyone to think that his enslaved people tried to kill him. So he put it in the beginning of his will. And then he goes on to say, my Negroes would defend me to the last. I wish all my just debts paid, and I trust my creditors will not force a sale of my property at a sacrifice, as I wish something left for my helpless family. I wish my son William to have good education, and I wish my wife to consult with my friend, Mr. William Parham, as to what schools he may be sent. And if he should prefer the study of law, he is to have my law library over and above his equal share of my property. In the sale of my property to pay the debts, I wish my Negro man king, his wife Rachel, and family. It's right there in the will. How did we get here? We went to the tree. We did our due diligence. We traced from my grandmother back to her father, my great-grandfather. We got to my great-great-grandfather. How do we find out his parents' names? We then went to the oral history that told us who their parents' names were. We found them on the 1880 and the 1870 census. We then searched to see if we would find my great-great-grandfather on any record regarding enslavement or anything. We came up blank. Looked for the nearest white person with the last name Atlas. Does not exist. Looked for a white person living near my ancestors who enslaved them. Does not exist. We then went out to newspapers. We found the newspaper article that told us who enslaved them. And then we did our research. Remember, I talked about building the tree of the slaveholder, having that context, making sure who's Colonel Short, where does he live? Where did I get the oral history? My cousin went and asked the family. I engaged with my family. This is some of the tools and tips I gave you in the first session. So you research Colonel Short, you get to his will, where he says, if my estate is insolvent, sell King and Rachel, sell Wallace and George Braddock and his wife, Alice, and their child with little Frank and the little place on the river. Now, if you are blessed to research in Louisiana, one of the things I love about how we do probates is that they are in successive pages in the book, which means that the inventory of the property is going to come up within several pages. And if you keep flipping, you'll find out that Hugh Short owned 2 plantations and that they enumerated or they documented down each one of them. And they have an inventory. And if you come over to just a few pages later, we enumerate item 2, Negroes. King, aged 55 years. His wife, Rachel, aged 55. William, age 19. And, which is short for Andrew, 15. This is confirming the oral history we had. Then here's the thing that shocked the pants off of me, or just shocked me. Here's little King, who's 22. Who is Drusilla? That's not Grandma Alice. Right there. Between King and Alice, or King and Rachel, and William and Andrew, and then you've got little King and his wife, that's $7,500 worth of his estate. So I want to also encourage you to keep paging over, okay? So this is my example of how to get to this. But this is not the only way, you all. There are several other records. And I know you all have questions. We're going to get to that as well. But I really wanted to be intentional and walk through this example for you so that you could see how you do it. Okay? Now, what are some of the other record examples? Here's an example from the Freedmen's Bureau. You will have records where they just tell you who the slaveholder is, just like that newspaper article, where you won't have to excavate clues how I had to excavate clues. It's okay. Sometimes you will just have it. This is one from M1905, which is part of the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a register of colored persons. If you look at the top of the page, It literally tells you who the former owner is. And I also want to point out, notice some of these people have last names. Freedmen's Bureau is available for free on Ancestry. Okay. Again, if you go to ancestry.com/Black history, you will get a direct link to the Freedmen's Bureau. So this is one example. Again, Freedmen's Bureau records are very broad in what they do. Underutilized part, again, hear me. If you all don't hear nothing else I say today, if you find that you have an ancestor who served in the Civil War, their service cards are the most super incredible documents, okay? And you can get these access to these on Fold 3, which is a part of the Ancestry family, okay? Now, here's an example of a service card. This is for a man named James Graves, who is in Company B of the 62nd U.S. Colored Infantry. This particular infantry was in Missouri. Why am I pointing out Missouri? Missouri had the highest number of slaveholders who claimed the value of their enslaved because they remained loyal to the Union. What am I saying? I'm saying that if your slaveholder did not align with the Confederacy and aligned with the Union, they could file a claim with the US government to get your value back when they let you enlist in the US colored troops. And this is the case across the board in the United States, but it's particularly the case in Missouri. So in this particular service file, you're going to see information like the hair color, eye color, the location where the person was born, when they enlisted. Again, move beyond the first page, you all. Get your page and pagination on. Claimed by James Graves of Lincoln County. Who was claimed? Wait a minute. The man that enlisted, his name is James Graves, but he's being claimed by somebody who was James Graves? What do they mean by claimed by? That means that James Graves was enslaved by James Graves. Scroll down. When you start seeing records such as this that are a different shape than these slim cards, it's telling you something else is going on. If we go to page 24, as for some of y'all, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this stuff was out there. It's been on the site for I don't know how long, but you just need to know how to get to it. So if we come in here, here is a claim for an enslaved person. I, loyal citizen James Graves and resident of New Hope, County of Lincoln, State of Missouri, hereby claim compensation under the provisions of the Acts for my slave, James Graves, enlisted November 2nd, 1863, at Troy, Missouri, by Lieutenant McReeds in the 67th Regiment of the United States Colored Troop. Here is the slaveholder. The name is right here. Now, listen, again, y'all been on here. I want to get you right. Okay? This is not an anomaly. Sometimes with these claims, they will actually tell you where they got the enslaved from. So you actually get another slaveholder. In this instance, James Graves comes over and he says, my claim for compensation of my slaves, James Graves, George Ross, and John, maybe Goins or Leans. Notice there's 3 enslaved people that he has that are a part of this regiment. They have different surnames, but they're enslaved by the same person. And he's making the claim for them. Why would he name his slave listen, that's a great question. I don't know. I have no idea. Now, if you're connected to the Indian Territory and you have ancestors who are in eastern Oklahoma or who connect back to the 5 tribes, being the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations, your ancestors may end up on what are called Dawes cards. You are looking at the Dawes cards. And with the Dawes cards, they tell you who the slave owner was. This is a rejected card, meaning this individual could not get citizenship in the Cherokee Nation. But we are getting the name of their slaveholder. This is my 3rd great grandmother, Marta Richardson. And her enslaver, who was a Cherokee by blood, is Alzira May. If you're researching the formerly enslaved in these nations, there are 2 sides to the card. One for the person applying, and also for their parents. And it's on one side, they're on one side, their parents, and their information is on the other. And it includes their slaveholder. Quickly moving forward, we also have access to auctions of enslaved people and bounties on freedom seekers. This is articles of enslavement. You can search for any name. You can put in Frank. And this is a collection that we developed using AI to isolate articles that mention enslaved people in the newspaper. And the first set of releases includes people who were runaways or considered to be runaways or self-emancipated, and auctions. If we click this example here, this is a free collection on Ancestry. It will give you the readout or the indexing information. And you can click the link to the article, which is free as well, on newspapers.com. This mentions an administrator sale. This is a key, you all. An administrator over an estate. Your next step will be to go and look for the probate. It's saying will be sold before the courthouse door in the town of Talbotton, Talbot County, Georgia, on the first Tuesday in May next, within legal hours of sale, agreeably to an order of the ordinary court of the said county, a Negro boy named Frank, the property of Mary Edwards, deceased. This means that you then take this, go to wills and probates on Ancestry, and search for Mary Edwards in Talbot County, Georgia, to see Frank and listen or look to see if he is enumerated or documented with a family group. Yes, you'll be able to listen to this in its entirety later. We also have things like the DC pension correspondence, because the enslaved in Washington, DC were emancipated earlier than everyone else, and their slaveholders could file the claim for their value within the United States. So let's go in and put in the name Mary, just searching. So if you have people who are in DC, you need to be using this because the slaveholders are directly named. And there's case files and correspondence. You can also search by slaveholder name and name of the enslaved. Do not forget about the slave narratives, where the WPA during the 30s went and interviewed formerly enslaved people and asked them about their lives as enslaved folks. You will find these interviews on Ancestry. And for the sake of time, I also want to point out, if you're researching in Louisiana, we also have another database that is free, Records of the Enslaved. It was a collection put together by Dr. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall that documents really the first 100 years of Louisiana, with the names of enslaved people and the slaveholders who they were being traded to and from. And with a number of these individuals, you will also find out where they were from in Africa. All right. I know I shared a lot. I sent you a lot of information. I'm so glad that you all are in the chat and you're using it wisely. I want to make sure that you remember this is recorded. You will be able to go back and watch this, okay? Can we put the links to the chat for people to connect with us? Absolutely, you should. Go ahead and do that. Someone else mentions, my maternal ancestor was from Madagascar. Okay, hold on. That question got removed. Okay, I'm a descendant of enslavers and have identified a few living descendants of one of the many people my ancestors enslaved. I have some details and even direct quotes from him to share. What advice do you have on whether and how to reach out to his descendants? I imagine many people would welcome this, but for others it would be upsetting. Totally get it, totally understand. Hold on for like 2 weeks. I'm not joking. Hold on for like 2 weeks. I can't tell you what, but there is a way to help you with the scenario until we get to that time span. What you can do is try to build trees out. So instead of you doing the slaveholder research in the way that I talked about it, where you have to research the tree of the slaveholding family, you are in essence trying to research the tree of the enslaved. And so put that tree out there. If you've got ephemera, or things connected to your family, scan that, upload it to the respective profiles of those enslaved individuals, try to trace them forward, as opposed to doing what we typically do in genealogy, which is tracing from now back into the time. There could be an enslaved with enslaver's DNA that could be an important clue. Absolutely. Yes, we pointed that out. Some of those folks may show up in your through lines, or you may look at, just different patterns in your DNA and see them start to emerge. It's likely that my second great grandfather was owned by a Broussard, but there were multiple Broussards that only owned 1 to 2 slaves. No family legend connections exist between my Broussards and slave owning Broussards. Because it's Broussard, you're already telling me it's South Louisiana. So there's that. So here's the question: which Broussards were your folks living closer to? or who were in the same police jury ward with them. Who do you see are notable broussards? If you look at records like the 1850 or 1860 slave schedules, are they all concentrated to one area? Have you mapped out how all of those broussards that may be slaveholding are interrelated? It's possible that your ancestor was passed through several generations of a slaveholding family and they all were broussards. Or it's possible that your ancestor could have been enslaved by one of the female broussards who married out into a different surname. The thing is, you still want to use the same tactics, which are looking at all of the clues, where they were living, who they were in community with, what they were doing. Are they found in the Freedmen's Bureau and Bank? Are they found in Civil War records? Are they found in wills and probates when you search? All the same skills apply. Again, keep it geographical. That typically will help, but you got to probably map out those slaveholding families. How can I see if the slaveholder family is my family when the CM cap is 6 CM? Sometimes you need to get in cahoots with your family members who have DNA tested, get permission and ask for them to share results. It's possible that if there's a connection to a slaveholding family, that it may be reflected more in your cousin matches than it is in yours. Next question. They think there was a violation. Think my grandmother's sister was really her mother. Can I prove that? Think the man who did the violation may have been another race. I have one male person I have 8% Irish from. What's the breakdown of the DNA? Well, that's the thing. You can use a process of elimination. Look at, kind of bulk the matches together, meaning if you've got the same trees repeated, you've got the same surnames repeated, same locations repeated, that's sending you a signal in your DNA that you need to be looking at that respective family. 2 questions about my free African American ancestors. How do I find out where they came from before they migrated to Ohio in 1843? How do I find what happened to my ancestor who was freed in 1838? Neither family in Ohio or the ancestor freed in Kentucky can be found in the 1840 census. It's probably that they were maybe potentially in the household of another person and marked as free, or they were likely enslaved. When you're talking about Ohio, it's Kentucky all day long. Typically, you need to look for manumissions. Again, look for private acts where slaveholders were freeing their enslaved. Who are they in community with when they get to Ohio? And can you trace those people back to where they were living in Kentucky prior to them moving to Ohio? That might be the clue for you. Also, you may want to look at county histories to see if there were mass migrations of particular families from one location to the next. That might tip you off who manumitted them. Traveled to Iberia Parish to search Iberia. I knew Mr. Broussard. I knew you were in South Louisiana. So far, deed shows Dugasses. How do I connect my Broussard to Dugasses of 1850 to 1880? Again, slaveholder research. At some point, potentially, the Broussards and the Dugasses intertwine. Where's that marriage? Think about seminal events in a family. It could be that your ancestors were given as a gift as a result of a wedding. Again, when someone dies, think of all of those instances where enslaved people could be gifted. That might answer your questions. Interesting challenge. I found documentation from my great-grandfather where her surname, grandmother, where her surname is listed as Grafton on the death certificate of her son in 1920 and Pompey on a death certificate for her daughter in 1918. She was born in Mississippi in 1869. Family stories indicate that she was reared by a white family. Name of the white family is unknown. Marriage record from 1888 has her surname Grafton. I can find everything on her from 1900 until her death. How would you proceed for searching for her in 1870? We're talking Mississippi, which can be a challenge. What I would probably do in this instance is I would maybe reflect her in the tree under both surnames until I could rule one out over the other. I would probably do first name searches only and approximate birth year on 1880 and 1870 censuses. In the areas, because you mentioned you've got a marriage license, but I would imagine that's probably after she may have moved to a different state. But where's the marriage license at, and where's that relation to Mississippi? Is it on the border? Is it close? I would look at those counties bordering. For instance, I tend to research Concordia Parish, Louisiana, but also Adams County, Mississippi. They're directly across the river from each other. So I'm wondering if it's a proximity thing. Also look at your DNA matches and what are the patterns you're seeing amongst those people. Let me get to maybe one more question because I don't want to hold you guys forever because we've gone like way over time. but I wanted to make sure you all got the information. Um, let's see. Okay, maybe, okay, this will be the last one. So Pro Tools will let me look for what I need. Can see matches with the same 2% Nigeria and other related people's DNA, but their trees are private and they don't respond. I know it's super frustrating. It can be like that. Yes, use Pro Tools, use matches of matches or your enhanced shared matches to drill down things, especially if you have 2% Nigerian ancestry. Again, remember, if it's a great grandparent and they are 100% of whatever it is, the ability for them to pass down that same ancestry through your tree, unless they marry somebody of that same, group, it gets cut in half every generation. So if you have 100% at a great grandparent, then their parent, then their child is 50, the grandchild is 25, and then you are up to 12%. So it's a range. It can go as high as that, but it can also go lower. All right, you all. It has been a time in the land, to quote my grandmother, Annie Atlas. You all have been excellent and great. I'm so glad that you joined me for this session. There will be more that are going to be taking place. You will have access to the recording. Again, if you are trying to look for links to things like articles of enslavement, where there are articles detailing the formerly enslaved, or the Freedmen's Bureau, which is free. Both of those are free on Ancestry, or even the 1950 census to get you started. Maybe a link to help build your family tree or to start that process. Visit ancestry.com/Black history to get started. And again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful day.